The crying stopped me before anything else did. I had my arm buried inside a coolant relay housing, grease up to my elbow, listening to the steady drip of something that should not have been dripping, when I heard it. Not loud. Not dramatic, just a small, tight sound, the kind a creature makes when it is trying very hard not to cry and losing the battle anyway. I turned around. Standing at the open hatch of my workshop was a Vithari child. She was small, even by their standards, with 6 arms folded close against her body, the way a person folds their arms when they are cold or scared. Her skin carried that faint blue luminescence that Vithari young have before it fades into adulthood. She had large dark eyes and a small flat nose, and she was holding something against her chest with 4 of her 6 hands, clutching it the way you clutch something when you are afraid that if you loosen your grip even slightly it will crumble completely. It was a toy. A little mechanical model, the kind that shows a solar system in miniature, with a tiny glowing sun at the center, and small jewel-like planets that were supposed to orbit it in slow, perfect circles. I had seen them in the gift shops near the docking rings. Vithari children loved them. The planets were not orbiting. The sun was not glowing. The whole thing sat dead and dark in her hands, and there was a crack running through its crystal core that I could see even from across the room. She did not ask for help. She just stood there and looked at the broken toy, and then looked at me, and I could see in her eyes that she had already been told, by whoever she had already asked, that it could not be fixed. I pulled my arm out of the coolant relay and wiped my hands on a rag. "Can I see it?" I asked. She stared at me for a long moment. I waited. I have learned, in 3 years on Varric Station, that patience is the most useful tool in any workshop. She walked across the room and held it out to me with all 4 of her lower hands, which in Vithari body language, I later found out, is the equivalent of trusting someone with something irreplaceable. I held it up to the light. The damage was clean, at least. The crystal at the core was fractured along a pressure line, the kind of break that happens when something gets dropped from a height onto a hard surface. The resonance frequency that powered the whole mechanism was gone. No frequency, no orbit, no light. The station supply store stocked nothing like it. I knew that without checking, because I had been through every shelf in that store twice. But I had other things. I set the toy carefully on my workbench and went to the cabinet where I kept parts pulled from decommissioned equipment. There was an atmospheric sensor in there, an old one, and its internal timing crystal ran on a resonance frequency that was close, though not identical, to what the toy needed. Close enough to work from. The child sat on a crate near the door and watched me. She did not speak. She did not fidget. She just watched with those large dark eyes, completely still, holding her remaining 2 free hands together in her lap. I got out the microlathe. The work took time. I had to reshape the salvaged crystal carefully, shaving it down by fractions, and every few minutes I would hold it up and check the frequency on my calibration reader, then go back to the lathe and shave a little more. It was the kind of work that requires you to stop thinking about anything else, which I find is the best kind of work. The station noise fell away. The hum of the ventilation system fell away. There was only the crystal and the lathe and the number on the reader that I was trying to reach. I reached it after about 40 minutes. I seated the crystal into the toy's core, closed the housing, and pressed the activation point on its underside. For one moment nothing happened, and I had a brief flash of concern. Then the little sun lit up, soft and warm, and the planets began to move, all of them, steady, slow, perfect circles, exactly as they were designed to travel, each one at its own speed, catching the light from the miniature sun and scattering it in tiny arcs across my workbench. I heard a sound from the direction of the crate. I had never heard a Vithari child make that sound before. It was something between a breath and a note, high and involuntary, the sound a creature makes when something they had stopped hoping for suddenly comes back. I turned around and held the toy out to her, and she took it with all 6 hands this time, and pressed it against her chest, and the light from the tiny sun glowed right through her fingers. She looked up at me. "Thank you," she said, in standard, very carefully, like someone using a word they have practiced. "Sure," I said. She left. I went back to the coolant relay. 6 hours later, Commander Hess found me eating lunch and told me, in a voice that had completely lost its usual confidence, that I needed to come to Docking Bay 7 immediately and not ask any questions. I asked several questions. He did not answer a single one. He walked very fast and kept glancing behind us at the observation ports that lined the corridor, and when I looked through one I understood why. 3 ships had come out of FTL and taken up position alongside the station. I knew Vithari vessels by shape, having spent 3 years in their space, but I had never seen ships like these. They were vast and dark, the kind of dark that absorbs light rather than reflecting it, and along their edges ran lines of bioluminescence in deep violet and gold. They floated in total silence, and their positioning was not random. They had arranged themselves in a pattern I had seen once in a history file about the Vithari succession wars. It was the formation an Imperial escort holds when protecting something of extraordinary value. I looked at Hess. He was staring at the floor and walking faster. The corridor outside Docking Bay 7 was quiet in a way that was not normal. Stations are never quiet. There is always someone arguing about cargo manifests, always someone running late, always the background hum of 100 different conversations. There was none of that now. Every person we passed had stopped moving. They stood pressed against the walls with their eyes forward and their hands very still, and the ones who noticed me looked at me with an expression I could not immediately identify. I identified it just before Hess opened the bay doors. It was the expression of someone watching another person walk towards something they do not yet understand. The bay doors opened. There were 40 guards inside, arranged in 2 parallel lines from the entrance to the center of the bay, wearing full armor in the same dark material as the ships outside, with violet and gold markings on their shoulders. Between those lines of guards and beyond them stood a crowd of figures in ceremonial dress, and at the far end of that crowd, where the light seemed to bend slightly around her as though reluctant to land, stood a woman. She was tall, even for a Vithari. She wore no armor but needed none. She wore a deep ceremonial garment that moved slightly even though there was no air current, and her bioluminescence, which in adult Vithari is normally barely visible, ran in clear bright lines along her jaw and the back of her hands. Her eyes were the color of deep space, dark with something moving behind them, and they were looking directly at me. I stood very still. I ran through the morning quickly in my head. The coolant relay. The merchant whose cargo hatch I had resealed after he snapped the locking pin. The atmospheric recalibration request I had ignored because it was listed as non-urgent. The child's toy. Oh, I thought. One of the ceremonial figures near the Queen stepped forward and spoke in Standard with a slight accent. You are the human technician designated Marcus Veld, assigned to maintenance operations, Varick Station, 3rd year of posting. That is me, I said. You repaired an item belonging to the Princess Sivri of the Vithari Imperial House this morning. There was complete silence in the bay. Behind me I could hear Hess breathing in a way that suggested he was doing calculations about early retirement. I fixed a toy, I said. Yes. The Queen moved then, just slightly, shifting her weight forward, and every guard in the room shifted with her in perfect unison, a single fluid motion, like one organism responding to a signal. She studied me the way I had studied the crystal that morning, with that particular focused attention that is looking not at the surface of a thing, but at how it is made. You did not know who she was, she said. Her standard was perfect, each word placed with precision. I did not, I said. I thought she was a dockworker's child, someone from one of the freighters. She was quiet for a moment. Several of the ceremonial figures exchanged looks. The diplomat beside me exhaled very softly, which I took as a sign that my answer had been either very good or very bad, and I could not tell which. You are aware, the Queen said, that my daughter's Valorous sphere was presented to 17 craftspeople before she brought it to you. 17, including the 4 master artificers of the hegemony, whose combined skill spans 2 centuries of training. I waited. They declared it unrepairable, she said. The crystal geometry is proprietary to a workshop on Veth Prime that closed 40 years ago. The specific resonance frequency required exists in no current catalog. I thought about the atmospheric sensor sitting in my scrap cabinet. I thought about the microlathe and the calibration reader and 40 minutes of quiet work. I used a salvaged crystal from a decommissioned unit, I said. Reshaped it on the lathe, matched the frequency by instrument. The geometry was close enough once I reduced the diameter by about 1.5 millimeters. Nobody in the room spoke. One of the guards made a very small sound, quickly suppressed. The diplomat beside me leaned in close to my ear and said, in a voice so low I almost could not hear it, the Valorous sphere is not simply a toy. In Vithari tradition, it is crafted by a parent at the birth of a child and encoded with a resonance frequency unique to that family. It represents a promise of protection made material. It cannot be replicated. When it breaks beyond repair, it is considered an omen of great loss. He paused. The 4 master artificers had the correct tools and the correct training, and they could not do what you did with a scrap sensor and a hand lathe. I thought about that for a moment. I looked at the Queen, who was still watching me with that precise, measuring attention. I did not know any of that, I said honestly. That, she said, and something happened at the corner of her mouth that the people around her reacted to with visible surprise, is apparent. There was a sound from the guard line to the left, and the guards there shifted aside without being told to, and Siavri came through the gap. She was still holding the toy. The planets were still orbiting. The little sun was still glowing. She walked across the bay toward me with the confidence of someone who owns the room, which, given whose daughter she was, she literally did. She stopped in front of me and held up the toy so I could see it clearly, and the light from its miniature sun scattered across the dark floor of the bay in tiny moving arcs. She said something in Vithari. It was short and direct, and she said it without taking her eyes off me. The diplomat translated without expression. She says you have good hands. I looked at the child with her toy and her 6 arms and her luminescent skin, and I said, "Tell her the lathe does most of the work." The diplomat looked at me for a moment like he was deciding whether to translate that. Then he did. Sivri's eyes brightened and she made the same sound she had made in the workshop, that high involuntary note, and she turned and said something rapidly to her mother. The queen listened. Then she reached into the ceremonial sash at her side and withdrew something small and flat, carved from the same bioluminescent material as the ships outside. She crossed the distance between us and placed it on the workbench beside me. I had not noticed the workbench was there until that moment. Someone had moved it in from somewhere, which, in retrospect, should have told me something about how carefully this meeting had been arranged. The object was a seal, oval, about the size of my palm, warm to the touch, with markings along its edge that I did not recognize but which made the diplomat beside me draw a quiet, sharp breath. "This is a mark of open passage through all hegemony space," the queen said. 37 systems, all ports, all corridors, indefinite duration. She paused. "It is also something else." I looked up. "My daughter has made a request," she said. "She asks that if her sphere should ever break again, it be brought to you." Behind me, Hess made a sound that I can only describe as a person quietly folding inward. I looked at the seal. I looked at Siavri, who was watching me with her large dark eyes and her toy and all 6 arms pulled close to her chest in that posture I now knew meant she was holding her breath. I picked up the seal. It was lighter than I expected, and the bioluminescence was warm, like holding something that had recently been in sunlight. "Tell her if it breaks again," I said. "She knows where the workshop is." The translator relayed this. Sivri said something back immediately, quick and bright. "She says she remembers," the diplomat said, and his voice had changed somehow, softer, like he had not expected to be moved by anything that happened in this room. "She says it is the workshop with the blue door and the dripping sound." It was the coolant relay. I had still not fixed it. "That is the one," I said. The queen held my gaze for one more moment. Then she inclined her head, not deeply, but unmistakably, the way a person inclines their head when they are acknowledging something real. She turned and walked back through her retinue and her guards, and Siavri walked beside her, and the entire formation moved with them like water around 2 stones. The bay doors closed. I stood in the quiet for a moment. Then I put the seal in my jacket pocket and walked back to my workshop with Hess trailing behind me in complete silence, which was the most unusual thing I had ever heard him do in 3 years. By the time I got there, the 3 warships were gone. I saw their FTL signatures on the station monitor, brief flares of light that folded inward and vanished. The station immediately began making noise again, voices and machinery, and someone down the corridor arguing about cargo manifests, exactly as before. I sat down in front of the coolant relay and looked at the tools on my bench. The microlathe was still sitting where I had left it. There was crystal dust on the workbench surface from the morning, fine and faintly luminescent. Within the hour, my door had 6 Vithari merchants outside it with repair requests, not requests made with the usual brisk indifference I was accustomed to. These were careful, formal requests, with proper greetings and the small hand gesture I had seen some of the older Vithari use when they were approaching someone they considered skilled. One of them had left a small woven object on my doorstep that I did not recognize. I asked one of the station translators about it later. She told me it was a recognition offering. Vithari craftspeople leave them outside the workshops of those they consider to be peers. I put it on the shelf above the coolant relay. An hour after that, a message arrived through the station network. The sender identification was a long string of Vithari characters that I could not read, but the station system had automatically translated the designation beneath them: Vithari Imperial Household, Personal Correspondence. The message was one line. It said, "Siavri asks what is the name of the small rotating tool." I sat with that for a moment, then I replied with one word: microlathe. 3 minutes passed. The reply that came back was equally short. "She wants one." I leaned back in my chair. The bioluminescent seal was sitting on the workbench beside my coffee mug, glowing very faintly, the color of deep water. 37 systems worth of open passage, sitting next to a mug with a chip in the rim that I had been meaning to replace for 6 months. I thought about the morning, the dripping relay, the child at the door, the toy in pieces. I thought about the atmospheric sensor I had pulled from the scrap cabinet without thinking twice. Because that is what you do when you see something broken and you have parts that might work. You try. You do not declare it impossible without trying. That is not something I learned in any training or any workshop manual. It is just the thing that happens when you see a broken thing and you have hands and tools and time. I opened my parts catalog on the terminal. I searched for microlathes. There was a listing from a precision tools supplier near the Veth Prime corridor. Child-scaled models with safety housings and simplified controls, designed for small hands. I looked at the specifications for a while, checking whether the collet size would accommodate standard crystal work, and it would, with one small modification to the tool rest that would take about 10 minutes. I added it to my order queue. Outside my workshop, Varric Station continued doing what stations do, loading cargo and processing travelers and arguing about manifests and chasing coolant leaks through the walls. In 3 years, it had never once struck me as remarkable. It still did not strike me as remarkable, but the seal on my bench kept glowing in the half-dark, and somewhere beyond the observation port, in the direction of 37 Vithari systems, a small girl with 6 arms and a perfectly orbiting toy was probably already asking her mother how long delivery from Veth Prime takes. I closed the catalog and finally got back to the coolant relay. The drip stopped 20 minutes later. It was a loose fitting, the kind of fix that takes longer to locate than to repair, and when it was done I wiped my hands on the rag and sat back and listened to the silence where the dripping had been. It was, on the whole, the most interesting day I had spent on this station. I was already looking forward to the next time something broke.